Hello and most welcome to H 765, and I call this lecture Know Thine Enemy, and this is exactly what the lecture is about. It's something that could be used, maybe not permanently, but a very good tool to identify the tendencies that could help the understanding of the whole thing, to put it very, very unclear. I would say all of a sudden our work got immensely easier. Not only have we completed 3-stage treatment of burnout and different pain circumstances, we will, from description of Iain McGillchrist, get a tremendous help in finding the characteristics of the enemy, and thereby to a lesser degree fall for his or her trickery and inventions. And of course I'm not talking about the person, I'm talking about the tendency. How could I explain this in some other term? Well, corona is a good example. If you want to treat somebody for corona, you will need to know if that person is suffering from corona and not from a simple cold or something similar. So you need to make a diagnosis. So vaguely you need to know what you are treating, what is getting closer to you. And I have the feeling here all these years, I know something was wrong. From the beginning it was like a surge in my heart that this can't be correct. A thing I actually shared with my fellow students, especially when we studied logic, then when our beloved professor Dag Westerståhl went a little bit too far and he took away himself and reality. We asked him, well, how about these propositions you put here? What about reality? And he just smiled at us, and he had stopped smoking a couple of years earlier, and I remember him still pushing his hand to his mouth and said, there's no need for reality anymore. This proposition, and he showed some really weird symbols on like this is true in itself. And that's when I think I had enough, all of us had enough. What would this true in itself mean? And if the world is unimportant, what on earth are we talking about? And I also had another professor, she was female, I don't remember her name, but she was interviewed by GP, and they asked her, all this logic you're a doctor in now, have you used it any time? And she just pondered the question for a while, and then she said, I don't think so, to be honest. And this is of course really, really bad. It doesn't really get any worse. Being wrong is actually better than having something that you think is right but you can't use it. This is something that Feyerabend pointed up. I completely agree with it. It's actually 10 times more worse to have something true but you can't use it. And this is a scary development. And as time passed, I began with Derrida. It was a big relief. It was a sigh of relief. Finally, there's some other options. Everything is not, like my dear professor said, decided from the beginning and there's nothing to do. There's scary things as well to say to someone. Derrida was an opening up, and almost simultaneously I ended up on Wittgenstein, and also he was a good help. He became a friend during these years, and I realized little by little maybe there is something wrong with the general tendency. But everything was sort of explained in, could I put this, in positive terms, which is not bad, and I think that's actually very good. But with positive terms in this example, I mean the side, the alternative is getting explained. Derrida is explaining his deconstruction by doing it. Wittgenstein did his thing. The critique is rather indirect. They don't identify the enemy. And of course, I understand why it is so, and I think it has to be that way in the long run. You cannot criticize something and not falling into the trap of making it stronger. That's always what happens. So criticism and arguing against something is something potentially very, very dangerous. And this is why nothing of logocentrism or the hypnotizing of picture that Wittgenstein mentioned has disappeared, because we are criticizing. It's very, very dangerous, because it makes the trolls even bigger. Don't mention the trolls, they're around you. But when I read Iain McGillchrist, I thought to myself, this is something really making my thinking so much more clear at some instances. And I thought to myself, why not use Iain McGillchrist for a while? It doesn't have to be the whole time. It doesn't have to be a foundation in itself. It doesn't have to be a new estate. It doesn't have to be the reification of what's crossed out. But it cannot be used permanently. But as a start to give oneself or us a couple of steps forward in a quick way, an instant fix to finally identify it. And it's not identified, which makes it even more not as dangerous of being reified. It's not identified through philosophical terms. It's indirectly identified through science, neurology. Iain McGillchrist had 2,500 different research reports for his first book. Now he apparently has even more, and they are all examples for instance, where you had a tumor, you had an accident, you had a stroke, there was an operation made. All these are very directly from reality. That's how it started. And that is not running in the same way a risk of being a new ideology. There's still a big risk, but it's much less, since it's science isn't as stubborn as the ideology could be. So it's an easier way. And once I thought that, I was starting to feel, let's do it. Let's go for it for a while. Because it's fantastic finally to know one's enemy. That is a pleasure in itself, and it makes me immensely happy. All of a sudden I get a whole round of arguments that have been lacking all these years. I had some arguments, yes, but usually I had to wait for the other one to propose their arguments, and then I have to look into them, and usually my arguments were, I wouldn't say hopelessly weak, but they demanded a lot of thinking from the other person, and that person wasn't willing to give it, of course, because he's already in the logocentric position, and as we all know, that position is quick to respond. It's based on argument. That's part of the problem. It's not based on reality, it's just arguments. This is of course what Heidegger meant by we are forgetting what is being, and we're just talking about the arguments instead, the ontic turn. And that doesn't give any food on the plate, doesn't give any substance, and therefore this huge lack, felt lack, there's something missing in the world feels empty, lacking of truth, reality, substance, dimension. And you end up in the cave, or you are in the cave because you constructed it by arguments. And yes, that's exactly what we want to avoid. We want to avoid an ontology that's based on arguments, why something exists, and not to ask those questions. Instead, base it on thinking, pure thinking, thinking things through. So let's cut to the chase. I think it's a great advantage, because you can also cite Iain McGillchrist now. A lot of people is doing it now. It's completely okay now, because the research report is the biggest one ever published. So that goes for a big credibility advantage as well. So let's start to identify the enemy. Well, one thing the left hemisphere, which is called, doesn't like is ambiguities. It actually completely hates ambiguities. Everything that's uncertain, everything that's not put on the table and clear and defined. It's not in the world, it should be out of the world. It should be taken out of the world. And of course, what is that? Well, it's nothing but monosemism, we mentioned before. Monosemism is the preferred thing for the left hemisphere. It cannot actually be any other way. Words can only have one meaning. And that is something that pervades the whole system. This absolute belief that every word has its fixed meaning, it's fixed in some way, doesn't have to be directly fixed. Well, if it's not directly fixed, it's going to be indirectly fixed. And if it's not indirectly fixed, it needs to be indirectly fixed. But somehow it has to strand on an argument. It has to be firm as the left hemisphere perceives it. And I've seen this for myself when I was studying linguistics. I went into the Chomskyan theory of language. And he has this essence, and the essence is very elusive. It's not clear, but he means that every language on this world is the same. So he needs to put indirect into indirect into indirect. And I remember looking at the whiteboard that was 10 meters a stretch. I'm not kidding. And it was completely filled with the indirectness. Different sort of equations to show that every language on this world was the same. And for every new language that was discovered, some new equations need to be put in. I think I mentioned before, the little green fellow from Star Wars, Yoda, is speaking in a way that Chomsky didn't like. I think he put the verbs first, something like that. That is not okay. That's not part of his monosemism. Another thing that the left hemisphere won't take in is any strain of reality. Left hemisphere is pure representation. It doesn't like the world. And here you have my old teacher, Dag Westerståhl. He did not like the world. To put the world into the whiteboard or his equations or his logic proposition was something ugly, something bad. And the same went for Hilbert and what Gödel tried to make. World shouldn't become into the picture. Everything should be ruled by itself. So that is a very, very good trait. Reality is something bad. Here we have something absolute definite of the left hemisphere and of our enemy. It's a little bit like knowing from which direction is the enemy coming. What sort of attacks can we expect? Well, the attack's going to be, how do you found what you say? What is the foundation of what you say? That attack can always be expected from the left hemisphere. It wants arguments and will put you on the spot. And once you start to produce these arguments and this logic for your own view, then you're busted. Then you do exactly the same thing that he or she does. You lost the game completely. You are playing his or her game. And this is one of the reasons it's so good to identify the enemy. Don't fall into that trap. Because the left hemisphere, although it's simple-minded in some respects, it ain't stupid. As Mark Twain used to say, it ain't stupid. It has its trickery, it has its machinery. It's almost like the devil sometimes. And it's very, very smart when it comes to put somebody on the spot. It looks for argument. Argue for your thing. And it's a little bit like if somebody convinced somebody else not to drink alcohol, maybe on New Year's Eve, it happened on our party. The person said in the end, well, at least you can try 2 drinks. Who won? Of course, the person who was arguing for drinking alcohol. And the left hemisphere has won when it makes the other person produce arguments. And that's why science is a bit better, because it is actually not arguments. It is from reality. And that is, in a way, very, very different. It's practice. So you see here, I think it could have been good to take this approach for a while and then sort of forget it. And you can have it in the back of your head. So when this situation turns up, either in reality or in writing or on Zoom or in your own head, for that instance, that might as well happen. You can make up a discussion, or you can think about things, and all of a sudden you're standing there and you make up your arguments, and then you're busted. Some more traits I think my colleague is going to like. The left hemisphere absolutely abhors the past. Everything that's in the past, it's never thought of. It's never mentioned. It's a little bit like, John, please don't mention the war. And therefore the left hemisphere, of course, hates etymology. Hates etymology. It was actually banned from linguistics when I studied it. It was referred to another institution. It was really the scapegoat of the institution. You had to have a little institution by its side called Jämförande språkvetenskap. There etymologies were allowed, where in linguistic etymologies was just a sort of argument, going from the now. Etymology, I remember, was explained like this. It's a way of explaining meaning coming from the present by using the past. It's a crazy way of evading the problem, and therefore no studies of etymologies was done in linguistics. Isn't that crazy? And I could say, when it comes to the history of linguistics, for instance, the Indians, they've done linguistics since at least 1,500 years ago. Most of what they did was etymology, both of the words, the meanings, and also the pronunciation and the development of the letters. That's really important. But at my institution, etymology was banned. It was the scapegoat. It was the nasty cousin you don't want to know. He had to stay at Jämförande språkvetenskap, and I went there. And that was much more fun as well. You learned about something. Well, let's identify left hemisphere. He would never ever like Derrida, for instance. That's sure. And if he or she likes Derrida, it's going to be this deformed Derrida. The first time I was exposed to Derrida was in that form. Somebody written a dissertation about Derrida and said Derrida had an essence. That essence was difference. Is that nice? The left hemisphere doesn't like the later Wittgenstein. If he can pick, he would choose the earlier Wittgenstein. Ever. hardly that even either. But if he has to choose, he would say, well, I would take Tractatus. But he wouldn't read it though. The left hemisphere does not like Heidegger, because Heidegger is undefined, he's obscure, he's not clear. Even his definitions are really changing all the time, and they seem to play their own game, and it's very obscure. I would say that left hemisphere wouldn't even like Husserl. It's epoche. No, what is that? No, we can't have that. Everything connected to an insight, everything connected to the body, the left hemisphere absolutely abhors. That's terrifying thing. Body should never be anything. Everything that's have anything to do with the material should be banned. Decoration should be banned. Everything that is not repetitive should be banned. Houses should be built like blocks, like boxes. They should not have anything in them that gives some pleasure to you, actually. And if there should be some pleasure, it should be highly regulated, and it should always be sort of pictures or photos or imagery or paintings that are not depicting real situation with live people interacting with each other. I think that fits the university quite well. Look at those paintings. If you find one painting, it's usually depicting of a deceased emeritus rector or something like that, or dean, I have to say. And this information I got from this fellow Orlando Wood. And when a left hemisphere person makes a painting, it's usually more symbols than actual things. And they often doesn't have normal posture. They usually just stand in a way that's actually completely unnatural. And their faces are usually not depicting anything real. There's no scars, there's no frowns, there's no motion. Anything that is irregular is taken away. It should be completely homogeneous. And speaking about that, what does the left hemisphere like? He or she loves Newton, doesn't like Julian Barber, and absolutely abhors, hates quantum physics. That I experienced myself, and finally I got words to describe what I experienced the first time I encountered quantum physics. I heard people, the most normal people you can think of, professors, doctors, students, who never been angry in their lives. They were screaming. The nicest people you can think of, good people, they were screaming. Why is that? Because the left hemisphere hates anything like uncertainty. It hates anything like non-localized. That's the absolute horror. That's the really worst. These people have been shut up, kept shut up for decades, never said anything. But this they couldn't tolerate. That's the weak spot of the left hemisphere. And this is another thing I want to point out. Know thy enemy. What is our weak spot usually? Well, we usually speak about the solar plexus. If you want to defend yourself, maybe a robber comes and you are good at throwing a punch, throw him in the solar plexus. What is the solar plexus of the left hemisphere? It's uncertainty. Then he falls. It's non-localized. Then he falls. It's undefinable. Then he falls. Anything actually connected to real reality, that's something he abhors. And why is that? Because the left hemisphere lives and thrives on representation. And that, to have a reality that's different and always has to be defined anew, or always is absolutely new, that is going against the grain of what the representation is, because that's always the same. So therefore, in the painting of a left hemisphere patient, one who had a stroke in the right hemisphere will depict a lot of symbols. Things that are not accurately drawn, but symbols instead of things. And amazingly enough, one thing you usually find in a picture of a right hemisphere stroke patient is this. It's an eye. And this eye sees everything. Almost always present somewhere. It doesn't have to be always an eye. It could be a sun, but with a little symbol to depicting the sun sees. And this is scary close to Lord of the Rings, where you have this creature who is only an eye and sees everything. It's not Saruman, but it's the overlord of Saruman. I forgot his name, but it will soon come to me. He sees everything, and that's the bad side. So unconsciously, of course, Tolkien depicted the left hemisphere. He knew the left hemisphere really well. And it became obvious to me already a couple of months ago that Tolkien is describing the left hemisphere in this big eye. And also how the people are acting who follow Saruman and his overlord. They are regulated, they are uniformed, they don't have real characters, and sort of they do not like odd things. Everything should be the same in their world. They are the homogeneous tendency. Something that also William Blake depicted so well in his illustrations, his etchings. He didn't like Newton, and left hemisphere doesn't like Blake. There you go. Blake is not a person for a left hemisphere. Maybe for the left hemisphere person to analyze him, give arguments for Blake, and thereby destroying him. That's fun for the left hemisphere. I sort of a relief at the same time. Do I need to mention that analytic philosophy is something that the left hemisphere absolutely adores, because it takes away reality? And why not Platonism in all its shapes and forms? The left hemisphere person in mathematics always is a mathematical realist. He thinks that numbers exist by themselves. They are not something of reality, they're something else. And that goes for 95% of the mathematicians today. And the poor ones, I actually was in contact with one, the constructivists, the right hemisphere mathematicians, that have a hard time, because we have a horrific dominance in some area of the left hemisphere, and the mathematics is such an area. So therefore, that's another reason to know thine enemy. There's a good reason in times of peril, and also in times of weakness, when you feel especially weak, you can always retract to the low level of left hemisphere. And if you don't have any energy, put your arguments so you survive that discussion. You don't have to do it forever, but it could be good in some cases to put your foot down, and you can be certain the more you go into the right hemisphere, the easier it will be to find arguments as well. Because once you understand they are not what substitute the world, you are not sticking to them. And when you're not sticking to them, they will come as flowing water, like a dance. It will be so easy to argue. If you need that, in those instances, that is called for. Because from the right hemisphere, you can find whatever argument you like. And it's sure as hell it's going to stick. And in this case, this is really interesting, left hemisphere will have its sets of arguments already done maybe, and not being able to change them too much, there is a sort of stiffness to the thinking. And that stiffness is stiffness in the body, and it's also the lack of prana, as we discussed earlier. The lack of prana, it's something very obvious for the left hemisphere. In Eastern Asia, left hemisphere dominance is rather rare. And these people understand ki, chi, prana, call it whatever you want. But left hemisphere doesn't like that as well. It likes the body to be shut down. It likes its emotion or its inner thinking not to be something that is adjustable or controllable. And this takes me to another marvelous feature of our enemy, and that is it doesn't really like free will. And that was the second point. That was such a big reaction when I first encountered quantum physics. And in this case, it was a professor in Swedish. He said, of course there's no free will. And he was so angry. And I think that person had never been angry in his life before. He was so angry. Because when he like in one way he accepted free will, just like words, but really believed that we constructed the world by ourselves and had a free will. He hated that. And I think that is something that De Bono pointed out as well. In modern academia, free will cannot exist because everything needs to be firmly established. Once you have monosemism, free will can't exist. How could it exist then? Because that's determined. You don't have the free will to choose the meaning of the words. That is already always decided somewhere in this horrible thing called the past. And let's not get into the past. Never open the door of the past. So will was something really bad, and I remember standing outside and these people were discussing with that. I was so upset about this free will idea. They didn't even have the words to express what they disliked, but they sincerely disliked it. And that I think they all agreed on. Free will was the most horrible thing this shell presented to them. And because that undermined all of their foundation, everything they've been fighting for all this time. And that points to another thing. What do you get from the real world? What is not representation? Well, the real world is differences, it's discrepancies, it's inequalities, it's space, I'd say, it's time, those things. It's the whole thing that contains knowledge. The left hemisphere doesn't like knowledge because everything is settled from the beginning. There is no room for knowledge. And the left hemisphere doesn't have a contact to the world. It's shut up from the body. It doesn't have any connection to proprioception. It cannot perceive. Its purpose is just to represent, not something, just to make representation. And we know that is the working of the left hemisphere. And that has its advantages. The left hemisphere is completely necessary. If you're going to make a plan, if you do other things, the left hemisphere has to be in at some part at least. Maybe not when it comes to the object, because it doesn't know objects or intention, but in the real construction of the order, the sequencing. But this was something that was abhorred, was disliked. And I noticed these fellows, they were actually Platonists. There was nothing new coming in. And they were not really liking the idea that educational systems should actually provide knowledge, because it went against the grain of what a representation is. Take Chomsky, he says you don't have to know any language to know what a language is. This is typical, and this is typical of linguistics, because none of these people studied any real language with any gusto. That's not interesting. Knowledge per se is something that gives the left hemisphere rashes. They get eczema, and they can get asthma, and they get seriously sick. And what all these groups fighted against quantum physics at that time, 97, I think that also was knowledge. As Iain McGillchrist puts it, left hemisphere lives on representation. Knowledge is the pure poison for it. Any knowledge that comes into the left hemisphere, it needs to defend itself, to shut that out, because that stirs all the perfectness of Newtonian space, of Newtonian time. All of a sudden something inhomogeneous knowledge comes in, because knowledge is always different. That is what knowledge is. And they hated that. They really hated that. And it's so interesting. These people would never engage in discussion otherwise. They're calm people, nice people, friendly people. But this was the solar plexus of the left hemisphere. And even though some of the opponents, like Torbjörn Tännsjö, he has a bad side to him. That's rather obvious. But these people didn't. They were really good people. But they were dominated by the left hemisphere. That's why they reacted so strongly for only one time. And I think after these 7 occasions, Tuesday nights was over, they tried to forget what they experienced as quick as possible, going back to the representations, ready form things, already made from the beginning, a little bit like boxes that you produce previously. And every little box is called knowledge, but it's just on the surface. It doesn't contain anything. It doesn't even contain a beetle, but they can be speaking about the beetle. The beetle you don't know. Maybe that was Ringo Starr. Sorry about the pun. They often see, the left hemisphere often see any information as unnecessary. And the last thing that Iain McGillchrist points out, the left hemisphere is passive. It's do not actively engage in the world. It makes sort of observations in the most passive possible way. The only time they say something about the world is afterwards, never before, in a way. It's not actively engaging in the world. It's not like Husserl going into the pneuma, be a noesis. That's an activation. No, the left hemisphere is passive. The representations are sort of dead or sterile or solidify. Representations is solidify, and your posture is also solidify. My professor Dag Westerståhl, he could hardly move. And he wasn't an old man by then. He is now, he's still a professor to this day, but he didn't move well. And that's very typical, because space around him didn't exist. And he constantly bumped into the furniture. That was also very typical. And that is typical for the left hemisphere. It doesn't know where it is. It abhors space, spatiality, and it also abhors time. For the left hemisphere, time is reduced to be a clock. Nothing you can actually understand or live in. In the left hemisphere, buses, they don't go on time, because you don't have a living time. You don't have the exactness that time itself can give. So, and that doesn't seem to matter, because the left hemisphere doesn't take criticism, because it doesn't know what it is. If you don't know reality, you cannot change. And one of the teachers said, if I would have changed, I wouldn't teach the same thing. So I cannot change. And I think there was an agreement in the smoking pause where he mentioned that. He said, yeah, right, I have to be the same. Otherwise I'd be lying to my students. I have to be the same, I have to teach the same. And they all sort of agreed. And there was so obviously into this representational mood. It has to be the same, because if I changed, I wouldn't be teaching them the same thing the next semester. It has to mean the same, it has to be the same, it has to be the same representation, because the world is just a representation. So now, dear fellows, I showed you some of the trickery and machinery of this devil called the left hemisphere. And of course, we should forget these tricks or these manners of handling after a while. But let's for a week or two enjoy this, pointing fingers at an enemy and enjoying to eat identify him or her and know thy enemy. It's fun in a way. It needs to be fun, and the left hemisphere doesn't like fun either, so let's do it for a while and then just skip it. Okay, thank you very much. It was great fun. Cheers.